have a brief time for immediate clarifying questions so that we have time at the end to have discussion across all of the papers and presentations. But so here, and I'm going to see, do we have a walking mic?
Thank you. Tommy Wiedmann, USW, Sydney. Just a very quick clarifying question. Did you exclude national scale papers? Okay.
So we were looking at the global scale. Yes.
Ah, yeah, okay, okay. Because, yeah.
One of the reasons also why we had to go through all these papers was we had selected these 2,000 papers and then we had to go through and also determine whether this was actually a national or a global.
Okay, okay, that explains it. We have a national scale paper with all 17 SDGs and 78 indicators, but only national, so yeah.
So it might be good actually if somebody is interested in trying to redo this.
Yeah.
But then actually also focusing on national.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I guess mine's a very straightforward question is, when are you going to publish this? Because it's exactly what we need for the best next assessment. And will the full database be available as well?
Yeah, we made the database. The database is the appendix to the paper. We originally submitted the paper to Nature Sustainability. They didn't want to publish it. And so now it's under review with a different journal. One that also published the target space paper. But so I expect it to come out relatively soon, I hope. But I was a bit surprised actually because I thought that was really relevant. I think for sustainable development it is important to get these scenarios. And secondly, I thought the paper was making a real nice point about how the literature now looks and what important areas for progress are, which among others are this trying to define the goals in a similar way so that the papers become a little bit more comparable, to try and increase the number of papers that look at multiple SDGs so that we not find scenarios that meet climate goals via lots of bioenergy and then make a different approach. And so we thought it was actually a quite relevant paper. Yeah. The editors have their own choices.
Quick question, going back to the roads from Rio, how did you decide which one is actually a hard target, like you showed it for mean species abundance, and which is a further indicator that you looked at?
Yeah, so I think there are two things. One is that we were discussing with the ministry which is the things were most interesting for them. But secondly, obviously we're running it with the image model. The image model was originally developed as a model for climate change. Automatically you describe energy and land use, so it has a very detailed land use system. From then on we started to broaden ourselves to the global environmental change and maybe sustainable development model, but it means that we are simply stronger in energy, climate change, and then anything directly related to land use, and we are weaker in some of the other areas.
Good, one last and then.
Sorry, I think mine is actually related. So for temperature, we have probabilities that we kind of how strict we can go. Do you have that for each of your target space indicators?
Clearly, for some areas, we are simply further ahead than other areas, and for climate, uncertainty is a critical issue. And so when we say 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, we actually say we meet this target with a 50% probability. And you could also say for the mean species abundance that biodiversity indicator you want to meet it with a certain certainty, but that's simply the research is not as far as developed as it is for climate.
Okay, thanks. I see there's already appetite for more, but we move on to Björn Sögel and have a look apparently at that paper with the 17 indicators. Although you'll probably also talk about the SHAPE project and the broader context there.
Also about that paper, but I'm actually now happy that I actually put it into the presentation.
and in this order.
Yes.
The presentation.
Do I need to do something for the presentation to come up? Oh.
Just open it on PowerPoint.
Mine was a PDF actually.
Yeah. Can you find it, or? Okay.
Just need to find out how to make it full screen.
Yeah. Oh no.
Okay, that's working very good. Yeah, so I will talk about sustainable development pathways. Obviously, I'll start with the paper that Detlef already announced, and then I'll move on to what we've been doing since, which is to broaden this space, not just in terms of the number of models used, but also in terms of the different societal perspectives that we try to represent in the sustainable development pathways. And this is really part of a much larger group effort by the Remind Magpie team at the Potsdam Institute that I'm part of, the colleagues from Message, Image and Reg modeling teams, some are here today, also a large group of people that have been working on the associated stakeholder dialogue, and apologies, I also forgot a few people that were working mostly on the social science aspects of this. No. Not intentionally, Julia. Okay, anyhow, so I think probably for this audience, it's obvious that climate action and sustainable development are intrinsically linked. So this is stated both explicitly in the text of the Paris Agreement and in the Sustainable Development Goals, where SDG 13 is highlighted. And I think that begs the question what the kind of sustainable development pathway needs to look like. And in AR6, there was one figure that I found quite useful on this, which you can see on the left. So it shows greenhouse gas emissions per capita versus Human Development Index. And you can see that there are essentially two groups of countries, the high-income countries in red here that have achieved high levels of human development, but at clearly unsustainable levels of emissions. And then the low or middle-income countries that are at lower levels of per capita emissions, but also much lower HDI. And that means for high-income countries, sustainable development pathways actually means moving downward here into the bottom right corner, and for low-income countries it means mostly moving to the right into the sustainable development corridor of high human development, low emissions, and you could make the same case for other environmental indicators. So the SDGs are of course the milestone for that in 2030, but it's also important to recognize that sustainable development doesn't stop in 2030 but needs to go beyond that to 2050 and beyond, where the planetary boundaries and the Paris target are obviously very important. So in the paper that Detlef already announced, we tried to embed this into the existing scenario landscape. So I'll briefly walk you through that. So if you start at the very left from a trends continued scenario, SSP2 with NDC-like climate policy, then we try to group this into different sets of interventions. The first two are related to human development and to resource efficiency. That would move you from an SSP2-like world to an SSP1-like world, which is already looking a bit better in terms of sustainable development. Taken together with climate policy, this is actually what I think the previous scenario landscape was putting as the most sustainable scenario in a lot of papers. However, when we quantified this against the SDGs, what we found is that actually there are still very large gaps towards the SDGs. And that's why in this paper we tried to come up with extra sets of interventions that related to food and energy, to global equity, and equality and poverty alleviation. And then again, we quantified this against the SDGs and found that although you're not meeting all targets, at least you're making much larger progress. And in a nutshell, that's what you're seeing here. So the bars represent progress towards the SDGs. Blue is the SDG scenario, and red is the trends continued scenario. And what you see is that across the board, these additional SDG interventions improve substantially over the reference scenario. However, the second thing that you can see on the left is that by 2030, it's actually really challenging to meet the SDGs because of the short time horizon and the inertia in many of the underlying systems. However, if you pursue the policies to 2050 and beyond, things are looking much better, so many of the targets can indeed be reached by 2050. So much on that paper. So now let's look forward a little bit, what we've been doing since. So far, I was looking at one sustainable development pathway from one single model, and so that there's at least two dimensions to explore here. I think it's clear that there can be different SDG-aligned futures, so they all share the same target space, but the path towards that target space might differ. That's the one dimension. And then, of course, different models might represent both the target space and the underlying dynamics a bit differently, and that's another dimension to explore. And that's essentially what we're doing in the SHAPE project. So 3 integrated assessment models, 1 industrial ecology model, and at least 3 different sustainable development pathways. So there's a very complex underlying scenario building process that I'll try to summarize briefly here. So we started by identifying a total of 12 relevant sustainable development dimensions. So you can think of these dimensions as kind of action levers. And in each of these dimensions, we tried to identify different ways how to pursue the SDGs and wrote that down first at a qualitative kind of narrative level. Then we aligned these dimensions still at the qualitative level to overarching scenarios that combine each of these 12 dimensions, which we then translated into a modeling protocol and quantified using the IAMs and the industrial ecology models. And over the course of that entire process, we had a continuing stakeholder engagement, and the main objective was here that these different sustainable development pathways actually also reflect different societal perspectives on how to best pursue sustainable development. So what does that mean in practice? This was at least alluded to already by Detlef today in the plenary. We have 3 different pathways, 3 different narratives. The first one's called economy-driven innovation, puts high focus on technology, efficiency, continued economic growth, and pricing is kind of your main policy instrument. The second one, called resilient communities, is a bit the opposite. So it emphasizes solidarity, equitable sharing of resources, human well-being much more strongly, and at least in high-income countries, it features a post-growth economic outlook. So that's something that's also quite new to the scenario landscape, I think. Here the main driver for transformation is lifestyle change and low consumption patterns. And last but not least, the one that we call managing the global commons has strong international and national institutions, regulatory policies as the driver for the transformation, and is sort of more moderate in terms of economic outlook. So then we started quantifying all the different drivers that you need to inform an IAM for these scenarios. So I'll briefly walk you through those. First one is global GDP per capita, where I already mentioned that the scenarios cover the range from continued high growth to post-growth. And that's what you can see here on the right as well. The interesting thing here is, of course, not just the global value, but also the regional differentiation. So here, as a proxy for global north and global south, I'm showing the OECD and EU R5 region versus the Middle East and Africa. And what you can see is that all 3 of these scenarios actually feature convergence between the regions in terms of GDP per capita, but the level of GDP per capita is quite different where that convergence takes place. For example, in the resilient communities, actually high-income countries level off fairly quickly, so it's kind of a soft landing scenario, and low-income countries converge to roughly the same level by the end of the century. We also quantified energy consumption patterns, so I should say that GDP was harmonized between the models, but apart from that, GDP and population, but energy consumption patterns and so on are then different in each of the models. And that's why you're seeing 2 sets of projections here, on the left from the image model, on the right from the Remind Magpie model, and again for the 3 scenarios. So there's one thing that they have in common. So all 3 of these sustainable development scenarios feature a reduction in global energy demand per capita, but then how large that reduction is, and also what the underlying drivers are is different. For example, in the economy-driven innovation one, you have relatively high demand for energy services, but also high efficiency, and it's a bit the other way around in the resilient community scenario. The dashed line on here is a rough estimation of decent living standards energy, which of course should be satisfied in all scenarios. Again, the regional breakdown is almost as interesting or more interesting as the global values. And again, I'm showing this for global north and global south kind of proxies, where again you see a convergence between regions, but the level at which this convergence takes place is different between the scenarios. Right, sorry for going through a lot of plots, but I think it's important to show this at least once. We did the same on the food side, so also for calorie intake, we have a convergence again between the different regions, but the level is different for the 3 scenarios. And again, the underlying drivers are different, and the dietary composition, for example, in the economy-driven innovation, it's an emphasis on cultured meat and other novel foods, whereas in resilient communities, it's a transition to more plant-based food. And last but not least, also on the material side, so that's the advantage of also having really a detailed industrial ecology model in the project. You can see cement demand per capita on the right-hand side here from the REC model and also from the message model. So we really try to cover this sustainable development space in a lot of breadth, both in the drivers, but then also in terms of the model results. So I'll use the remaining few minutes to walk you through that. There's, of course, a number of things that are very similar between scenarios and to a certain extent also between models. So all of these scenarios, of course, need to be aligned with the Paris targets. So that means they need to reduce emissions quickly to roughly meet 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. And that is quite similar between the different scenarios. There's a bit of a difference between the models that you can see here. Image tends to be a bit less flexible on the energy side than Remind. So that's, I think, also something interesting that you learn from this model comparison. In which cases you have kind of a very robust feature, in which cases you have differences between the models. One important aspect is also the carbon price that you need in order to meet that climate target. So here again, I'm zooming in on just one model, and what we find, and that's also again robust across the models, that the resilient communities scenario, which is kind of the post-growth outlook, needs a much lower carbon price. And that's not very surprising because if you do a lot of change on the demand side, behavioral change, low consumption patterns, then you need a much lower carbon price in order to reduce emissions to Paris-compatible levels. And I should also state here that now here I'm really just comparing within that sustainable development space. If you compare that to standard scenarios, SSP2-like mitigation scenarios, you would need even higher carbon prices. We also looked on the land side. I just pulled out forest area here as one of the many indicators that we're quantifying. So again, across all models and across all scenarios, you see that these sustainable development scenarios come with an increase in forest area. However, again, the drivers are different. So in the economy-driven innovation scenario, it's mostly land-based mitigation. So for example, afforestation with fast-growing species, whereas in the resilient community scenario, it's a consequence of reduced consumption patterns and also protection of forest areas. And the Managing the Global Commons has a combination of both. And it's actually interesting if you look here at the Remind Magpie results, the economy-driven innovation has the largest increase in forest area. But if you go to biodiversity, it's actually the scenario that performs worst in our results. And that's a consequence of precisely doing that afforestation with fast-growing species, which gives you less of a benefit for biodiversity. And I think that's actually quite an interesting trade-off also to explore even within that sustainable development space. And as a consequence, we find that this economy-driven innovation scenario actually struggles to meet the biodiversity target that we put. Sorry. Better now? Cool. Right. So there's a lot more SDG indicators that we're working on. Many of these we've already had in previous papers, things like poverty, inequality, air pollution, also education and gender equality that unfortunately we don't have endogenously in the model, and many other things as well. So currently we're working on pulling this together also for the new sustainable development scenarios that I just showed. And let me close with a small outlook that's not related directly to SHAPE, but actually topically it is. So we just did this policy paper for the German Environmental Ministry. And one of the areas they were interested in is infrastructure for the SDGs. So we asked the question whether carbon pricing can actually be used to fund the infrastructure investment needs for the SDGs. The answer that we got is partially, but it differs very much by regions. So some countries in Southeast Asia seem to have that opportunity to at least partially fund SDGs with that, just in terms of comparing investment requirements and potential carbon pricing revenues. For especially sub-Saharan Africa and other low-income countries, the situation is much more challenging in that comparison. Right, so I'll wrap up here. So I made the obvious point to begin with that climate action and SDGs are highly interlinked, and in passing also touched upon some of the modeling challenges. So covering the full SDG space with a model that, as Detlef also said, hasn't been originally built for that. That has been quite a challenge and continues to be so. Also the question of intervention, so what is something that you have endogenously in the model and what is something that you do in post-processing or in scenario assumptions is an evergreen in that kind of modeling work. And in terms of the SHAPE project, what we're really trying to do is to represent different pathways towards the SDGs and also making sure that also different societal perspectives on sustainable development are represented in that scenario zoo. And the green growth versus post-growth is perhaps the most prominent example because that's an evergreen debate, but we have many other dimensions on that as well. The first results showed that the post-growth pathway, we call resilient communities, actually eases the mitigation pressure quite substantially, whereas the high growth pathway, economy-driven innovation, really has difficulties mostly on the biodiversity side. So I'll stop here and look forward to questions and discussion.
Back to the front. You have any questions for Björn, Paula?
Thanks very much. It's fascinating. Can I just ask about your stakeholder process? Who were the stakeholders and how did you manage the process to get the diverse perspectives, and how did they reach consensus on those three scenarios?
Yeah, excellent question. So we had a whole team at IIASA and at SRC that tried to do a broad outreach here. Melanie, Sarah Connell, Anna Paula Aguiar, and colleagues. So we tried to be as broad as possible in terms of academics that work in scenario development, NGOs, people from the policy sphere, and many others. I guess one of the challenges that we had is that especially academics with sort of previous involvement in that scenario space are most likely to respond to such requests. So that's something that sort of we were trying to rebalance also as we went along. Then I think we didn't necessarily require to reach kind of a consensus. Also in stakeholders from different regions, there were different perspectives on which of the scenarios are feasible or desirable. And I think just the fact that you don't narrow it down to one scenario, but that you keep multiple scenarios, keeps at least part of that diversity.
Marijke Kuiper from Wageningen Economic Research. I have a question on the scenarios where you have a lot of behavioral change, lifestyle changes. How do those come about? Because I've seen a lot of those studies where people say suddenly wake up vegetarian and we have no idea how we make that dream come true. So what are the costs involved and how do you achieve that?
Yeah, excellent question. So it's definitely not the wake up vegetarian, even in the results that I showed at the very beginning and in the post-growth scenario, there's kind of a gradual transition to the Eat Lancet diet by 2050. So that means we have 30 years to wake up vegetarian or almost. But I agree with your point that the underlying behavioral mechanism, that's something that's very difficult to represent in the IEMs.
Plus the cost.
Yeah.
Because that makes an important impact in how you assess the impact of it. You compare it to the tax.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I guess just by the fact that we go now from one scenario to three scenarios that also broaden up on that space, you're capturing at least some of that, but I agree that the underlying mechanism we haven't represented yet, and that's definitely something to improve on.
Hi, thanks, Chris, University of Leeds. I just wanted to ask a clarifying thing about, I think the initial paper you spoke about that you'd done, about the SDGs and progress towards them in different future scenarios. It looked quite pessimistic. I just want to clarify that's the case, because I think involved in those, you had the bars of meeting them to 100%. I think there might only have been one or two that were kind of met by 2030, even under the optimistic scenario. Is that true, and implications of that and lessons from that at all?
Yeah, I think it's a reality that by now, especially after COVID and the war in Ukraine, that neither of them are in this modeling, but at the very latest after that, I think it's a reality that we need to face that meeting the SDGs as a whole by 2030 is looking more and more unlikely. That of course doesn't mean that it's futile, but even with very, very optimistic assumptions, you can only make certain progress until 2030, and that is because there's a lot of inertia in underlying systems. Maybe education is a good example. Even if you had full enrollment rates for boys and girls from now on, you still wouldn't reach education targets maybe because there's many adults that haven't had schooling. And for many other subsystems that are relevant to the SDGs, you can make similar statements, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. I think we need to move on if we want to keep a bit of time at the end for discussion across all of the talks. So, and I see there's much more appetite for questions, but yeah, so then we move on to Inayat Molemi from Deakin University, and he'll talk about using diversifying models for global change and sustainability analysis. Okay, just start, you'll switch.
All right, thank you. What I'm presenting is a collaborative research that I did with Lei Gao, Sylvia Lecoeur, and Brett Bryan on the use of non-marker integrated assessment model. Oh, yeah. The use of non-markers integrated assessment model with system dynamic methodology. With an aim to broaden and diversify the models that are used for scenario generation and sustainability analysis. I'll start with a bit of background about system dynamic methodology, and then I'll present simple applications of sustainability analysis with system dynamics, and then I'll finish with some concluding remarks. System dynamic as a general tool for learning about complex systems relies on understanding causal behaviors and interactions between and within systems. For example, how the decisions that we make impact the environment, how the changes in the environment in return shape the decisions that we make, understanding the side effects, and also understanding how trade-offs between conflicting goals could make any change in the dynamics of the system. It started primarily by Jay Forrester's work at MIT, and also later underpinned the seminal work of the Limits to Growth in 1972. I guess since that time, the co-evolution between sustainability science and system dynamic has continued in multiple frontiers. And perhaps in the last 5 to 10 years, it has been more related to topics such as the SDGs and climate change research. And among specific model examples related to these topics are the Felix model, which was originally developed here at IIASA, the ISTG model from the Millennium Institute, EARTH from Norwegian Business School and the Stockholm Resilience Center, and C-ROAD and N-ROADS co-developed by MIT and Ventana System Group. I guess apart from these more integrated, higher scale example of models, the application area for this modeling methodology is quite broad. It includes many smaller scale models directly or indirectly related to almost all SDGs and different ways that they could interact, with case studies across locations and also at different analytical scales, from communities to cities to subnationals to countries. So I guess it's fair to say that the literature for this area is rich, and it can have an important contributions in diversifying the models that we use for scenario generation and sustainability analysis. With this background, the study that I'd like to share is an example of global sustainability modeling with system dynamics methodology. The study that we did had 2 aims. So the first aim was to have new projection of reference scenario frameworks, the SSP and RCPs, with a non-marker model. There are studies which, again, recently highlighted how the feature of scenarios that we have are dependent on the feature of the models that we use, and also the biases that the modelers built into these models, and therefore why a greater diversity of models should be welcome to gain more robust insight. This also supports the idea of using a non-marker system dynamic model, which has a different methodology, different sectoral boundary, different level of structural complexity, and can potentially offer new indicators. And all this can come in support of currently established and more complex IEMs to expand the scenario space. On the other hand, models with system dynamic methodology are supposed to be good in simulating the effect of feedback interactions and also delays between causes and consequences, which could lead to some sort of dynamic behavior emerging over time in a longer term time frame. With this and as a second aim, we wanted to see to what extent sustainability progress towards a specific quantitative targets could be accelerated, driven by these feedbacks and delays embedded into the model. If we go beyond the initial 2030 milestone and we look at progress by 2050 and 2100. The simulation engine or the model that underpins this work is Felix. As I said, it was originally developed here at IIASA and then later advanced in different ways by different people. If anyone is interested in this particular model, there is a presentation by my colleague Sibelecker tomorrow after lunch in session 42. So you're welcome to join if you want more insights about the details. But in general, Felix has a representation of 11 systems representing 8 SDGs in one integrated framework. It doesn't have a very detailed view of these systems with the IEM standards, but this fairly simplified representation allows the model to have these systems in one integrated framework, which is something useful to see how different things interact and co-evolve. With this simulation model, the first step for us was to implement a set of SSP-RCP combinations as illustrative pathways to analyze. We followed a standard story and simulation approach where narratives from 5 SSP-RCP combinations were used to specify the initial condition of the model, and then the model took over to simulate these narratives in quantitative terms. Because of the computational efficiency that these type of models usually have, we ran 10,000 model evaluations per each pathway to take into account uncertainty in input parameters and also see variations that we get around each pathway. Also, we cross-checked what Felix projects with those of other integrated assessment models across different control variables for validation purposes. As a second step, in order to be able to quantify sustainability progress and not just projects the indicator values in their absolute physical units, we also needed to have a set of well-defined transparent indicators and target on these indicators. So we implemented 36 indicators related to the 8 SDGs that was within the scope of our model. And indicators were selected through a 3-step decision tree. And then we set targets, quantitative targets, based on the literature on these indicators by 2030, 2050, and 2100. And obviously, targets in 2050 and 2100 were more ambitious than those that we had initially in 2030. We also had 3 levels of target at each of these years to account for potential disagreement that can exist in defining the value of the targets. And then we finally quantified the actual progress based on the normalized gap that we have from the projected value of the indicators to the quantitative target that we set in a range between 0 to 100. And then we visualized the quantified progress by 2050, 2100, 2030, 2050, 2100 across the pathways that we modeled, both at the indicator and also at the goal level. I guess we don't have much time to go into the details, but I guess the overall insight was that the trends could be improving by 2030 when looking at pathways of bolder sustainability actions, again, within the limit of the selections that we had. But the chance of actually meeting the targets by 2030 across all the pathways that we modeled, and also in most of the indicators, especially those related to environmental indicators, was really low because of the inertia and the momentum of the BAU systems for change in a short period of time. But in a longer time frame, and by 2050 and 2100, with more ambitious targets that what we already had in 2030, this initially limited progress can be substantially accelerated, driven by the delayed interactions that underlines the model SDGs in Felix. For example, one of these delay interaction was between socioeconomic and environmental component in Felix. And Felix projects change in demographic patterns to happen post-2030 and by 2050, change towards a population of a smaller size with more access and better quality education. This demographic shift in the model leads to behavioral change and encourage more sustainable consumption patterns. For example, there is a specific link between diet change and the level of education in Felix. Change in consumption patterns drives change in production systems, and change in these two systems translate into consequences for the environment in terms of emission, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. And this explained basically the chain of this chain of causes and consequences explain the initially limited and then later accelerated progress in the environmental SDGs such as SDG 12, 13, and 15. To summarize, there are some pros and cons with this modeling methodology. First pros is that I guess there's a diversity of models with system dynamic methodology in relation to different SDGs, which can be used in isolation or in interactions with each other. And some of them are more related to societal SDGs, something which maybe the established integrated assessment models are not like very good at, so they can be linked and support each other in those aspects. The second aspect, which is a positive point, is that because of the simplicity, you can have different systems in one integrated framework, and therefore you can better account for the effect of feedback that you have, for example, between human and natural systems. And also, again, because of the simplicity, you're able to run your models for more time. You can have a larger ensemble of scenarios, and therefore there is an opportunity for integrations, for example, with the statistical methods or machine learning techniques, which need a larger scenario ensemble. There are, of course, limitations. They have much less details on air system processes compared to current integrated assessment models. They are not suitable for multi-scale modeling and also spatial modeling. And there are obviously biases in formalizing the interactions in the model. That's all from me. Look forward to comments or questions.
Thank you. Julia?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this. A short question. Why would SDG achievement accelerate after 2030? What's the reasoning behind it?
Yeah, I guess it's just the longer time frame that we have for the effect of some of the changes that we implement in some of the pathways to appear. And as I mentioned in one example, the effect of interactions also appear in a longer term time frame, like for example the interactions that we have between demographic change and its effect on consumption and production system, and also consequences for the environment. I guess the message is not to delay action to beyond 2030. Obviously every system change is needed, but it's more a matter of having a longer term view and seeing the change and the progress that we make in broader perspective.
Yeah, Jessica Jewell, Chalmers University. Thank you so much for an interesting presentation. I have a question on how you validate the feedbacks, because if you have certain feedbacks in the model, you don't know if you have all feedbacks. So how do you validate that you're actually capturing the system and not missing something that's really going to slow down the change?
I guess we have definitely missed many interactions in the model, and as I mentioned, as one of the voices of this modeling methodology, which could be probably the case for other types of model as well, is biases and uncertainty in understanding the interactions. There are limitations in the things that you can model at the end, and you're obviously not including all the feedbacks and interactions that you have. What we did as validation was to, so we had some historical data to compare what the model projects in a certain historical period with documented data. We also cross-validated the modeling behaviors and some output variables with other linear assessment models. But I guess there was no formal process for validating the coverage of feedback and action. But I wasn't involved in the development of the models it happened between 2010 and 2013. But I guess there wasn't any formal process, and I mean, there was an acknowledgement that they are not going to cover everything.
Okay. Yeah, one more, and then we need to move on.
It's actually not a question. I just wanted to confirm that also this paper was among the 7 that were found to be the most comprehensive in SDG achieving.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a remote speaker with a recording now. I just don't hear any sound. Which I think we should be hearing. I doubt it. This needs to be on here. Where's the? Oh, the sound here is off. Okay. Technicians, please. Sorry, I don't know. There's too many cables here to actually figure out. I see a lot of movement in the back for those in the front here, but it's not playing. Or somewhere. We just need to play the recording from anywhere so that it's visible here and not. If in the meantime anyone has a question for one of the speakers that we've already had, because I had to cut off a few questions, let's throw in one.
I'm Carolina Zelt-Ziegler from Öko-Institut, and I wanted to ask a question to Björn. Did you consider negative emissions for the scenarios and the carbon budget, so that some were overshooting and then you reduced the emissions?
To a certain extent, yes.
To a certain extent, yes, but much less than in standard mitigation scenarios. And then it's also, again, differentiated between the scenarios, so that the post-growth one has, because of the changes on the demand side, much less reliance on negative emissions than the ones that do more on the supply side.
Thank you. Should we be ready? Yeah, the last percent always takes half an hour. And if not, we throw in one more question. Jarmo.
Yeah. Also a question for Björn. You basically showed carbon pricing, right? But I think rightfully there was a question that not everything is captured by the models, right? And the carbon pricing, that it's lower because there's lower demand that needs to be satisfied, makes sense from a modeling perspective. but how do you see this basically as a limitation to the interpretation of some of these results?
Yeah, good question. I think there are several parts to that. Giving maybe just two. One is that behavioral change, so the notion that people could actually, because they care about the environment and the climate, could choose to drive smaller cars or use their bike more or live in smaller homes. That doesn't come at a cost. But then, of course, there's an efficiency perspective also. Part of it also happens to increased efficiency, and that initially has investment costs. And these, I think, are partially at least captured in the models, not to the full extent. So I think we're working our way gradually to have this better captured.
Okay, thanks. And then we should be ready to go to Purnima Kumar from C-STEP in India, talking about using the Safari model.
About the sustainable alternative
Hopefully.
for India, or Safari model, and how we can use it to explore integrated scenarios for reaching climate and sustainable development goals. This is for the Scenarios Forum, session 47. Safari, or the Sustainable Alternative Futures for India model, is a system dynamic simulation model. It looks at the long-term development pathways that are available to India, and it focuses on the energy, resource, and emissions outcomes of various scenarios. It's a goal-driven model, and it allows users to experiment with a variety of intervention levers and create scenarios of their own. It currently operates on an annual time step and looks at a 2050 time frame, but it's being extended to 2100. Its key use is in helping identify trade-offs and interlinkages between various goals in conventional sectors. As you can see from the image above, its key driver is population. Bottom-up demands inform supply needs over time, and the interactions of these demands and supply sources also impact materials and resource availability. Safari looks at 8 goals, primarily 8 developmental goals, and the way these were selected was that we looked at goals that were in line with the SDGs, but were also specific to India and in line with the Indian government's development targets, and goals that had a direct bearing on energy demand and emissions. And we've got a list of 8 primary goals that Safari looks at, and different benchmarks that we've set based on all of the literature review and expert consultation that we've done. So we look at housing, and then infrastructure for education and healthcare. We look at power or electricity. We look at water, food, clean cooking, and transport. And apart from these, we also look at the rest of the economy, but these are the goals that we focus on in a bottom-up way. And as you can see here, the primary linkages of these goals with the SDGs is what has been shown in this image, but you could also indirectly link many of these goals and their outcomes with the other SDGs. And there are many levers you can play around with, but for illustrative purposes, we've made a few scenarios here. The reference scenario assumes that all development gaps are filled, but without any particular focus on environmental outcomes. That's what you see on the upper left. Then you have the sustainable development scenarios, the 2 scenarios that are illustrated in the middle, SDA and SDB, which look at varying degrees of improvements aligned with emissions reduction. SDA assumes that all technological efficiency improvements that are possible are implemented across sectors by 2050. SDB, on the other hand, assumes that in addition to these technological improvements, there are also behavioral shifts aligned with consumption reduction. For instance, dietary shifts, changes to size of houses, building materials adopted, and things like that. The overconsumption scenario on the right-hand side looks at what might happen if India takes the opposite direction and basically starts to consume as much as OECD countries do now on average. In our reference scenario, you see that residential energy demand actually takes up quite a large chunk of electricity demand by 2050. This is partly due to high cooling demands, and you see that this is followed by commercial buildings and industry as well. The final energy per capita in 2050 in our model is about 33 gigajoules per capita, which is consistent with results from other models that look at similar factors. So as you can see, some of the most impactful reductions are possible in buildings' energy consumption, and this is particularly through lowering the energy impact of space cooling. So like I'd already mentioned, in SDA, we've assumed that a lot of technological efficiency improvements happen. So for instance, air conditioners become more efficient, and that reduces the emissions impact of the building sector. But in SDB, we also assume that there are behavioral shifts. For instance, people are more willing to adopt alternative materials in their construction, and they're more willing to look at passive cooling methods. So all of these put together cause another dip in buildings' energy. As you can see, some of the most impactful reductions are possible in buildings' energy consumption, particularly through lowering the energy impact of space cooling. As I've already mentioned, in SDA, we focused on technological efficiency improvements. So we assume that active cooling, which constitutes the largest chunk of energy demand from buildings, becomes more efficient, and that there's a greater penetration of efficient appliances. SDB, on the other hand, assumes that in addition to this, the need for space cooling itself reduces through better passive design and alternative materials that provide better thermal comfort. This is followed by the transport and agriculture sectors, where we see that fuel shifts, dietary shifts, and then changes to overall demand patterns have the capacity to make a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, not all interventions are complementary. Some of them do have trade-offs. Like when you start looking at using more biofuels for transport, there are constraints on water and arable land, and then dietary shifts towards coarse cereals and effectively reducing the amount of rice cultivated can have impacts because these coarse cereals have lower yield. Then for instance, if you consider increasing electric mobility, but you don't see as much grid decarbonization, that might not have as much of an impact as you would expect. And compact cities and urban densification, if these are done without adequate focus on building materials and reducing overall transport demand, you could see a situation which is quite similar to what we see in a lot of cities today, where there's a high urban heat island effect, and overall buildings' energy consumption increases instead of reducing, and in fact creates pockets where you have extremely high levels of energy consumption in urban centers. Okay, let's look at the urban example a little bit more and focus on the interactions between housing, transport, agriculture, industries, land, and water. So in Safari, housing demand is met through construction, of course, which depends on the availability of materials and water. And what the model does is it calculates shortage annually by factoring in things like dilapidation, population growth, changing household size, changing carpet areas of houses, in things like that in real time. And our estimates suggest that we need an average annual construction rate of about 3.8 million houses per year instead of the current average of about 2 or 2.4 million to meet housing shortage by 2030. And then this will have to be more or less maintained until 2050. So now, to get into this a little deeper, there are a lot of different levers that you can use to create scenarios. For instance, in the housing sector, we can look at things like the area of an affordable house, and then the average area of middle and higher income housing, the number of houses that a household owns, and the frequency at which a household chooses to reconstruct or refurbish their house. Then the materials that a house is constructed with, average floor space index for urban areas, open space per capita, and appliances for electricity demand. So as housing demand increases, industrial capacity to produce basic materials is ramped up. And cement and steel are particularly emissions intensive. A lot of India's cement and steel demand comes from buildings, especially housing. So one way to reduce this pressure is to switch to alternative materials that either use less cement and steel or alternatives that use byproducts from the industry like fly ash. Housing and transport are also closely linked in the model because urban form can impact cooling demand and also built form, modal share and trip lengths. In the transport sector, we look at things like average trip lengths, modal shares between public, private and non-motorized transport, and fuel efficiency. So ultimately, we derive the greenhouse gas emissions, particulate emissions, embodied and operational energy demand, and new urban land demand. So that's where agriculture comes in, because housing and agriculture compete for land, especially on the urban peripheries. Arable land is a key component to ensuring food security, which means that urban sprawl could actually impact food security if this isn't taken care of, because even though there isn't an absolute land shortage in India, there can be localized competition for land. So this is just one of the ways in which all of these different sectors interact with each other, and the ways in which some of these goals can have either complementary outcomes or they could have trade-offs as well. If you have any questions or you'd like to know more about the Safari model, please feel free to reach out. These are my contact details. You can also check out our website. Thanks so much for your time.
Will one only reduce emission growth, but actually are still at higher emission levels than today. So did you look into what would be needed to actually reduce emissions below current levels and eventually at some point maybe also beyond 2050 reach net zero?
Hi, so I actually missed the first part of your question because I think the audio wasn't connected, but are you asking if we've looked beyond 2050 to see how we can reach net zero and how we can maintain these mitigation actions?
Yes.
Is that your question? Okay. Yeah, actually we are in the process of extending this model to 2100 and we have looked at net zero briefly. We kind of expanded on the scenarios that we have here, but we also looked at sort of some in-between scenarios, especially along the lines of reaching a 2017 net zero target, because that's also what the Indian government announced earlier, late last year, if you remember, at COP26. So ahead of that, we had actually kind of looked at what it would require to meet net zero by, let's say, 2050, 2060, 2070, and 2080. And 2070 was what we've ultimately, sort of zeroed in on now. But what we are doing is kind of that was a quick exercise, and now we're trying to expand the model a little bit more, both in terms of its time frame as well as in terms of the different interlinkages that it looks at, to be able to kind of look at this more comprehensively.
Okay, thanks, Purnima. We have to move on to the last speaker, which is also a hybrid speaker online, so we'll play the last presentation.
Welcome to this presentation. My name is Elise Leroux, and I work at the Institute for Security Studies. The IISS partners to build knowledge and skills that secure Africa's future. Our goal is to enhance human security as a means to achieve sustainable peace and prosperity. We are a non-profit organization with offices across Africa, and our work covers transnational crimes and crime prevention, migration, maritime security and development, peacekeeping, peace building, criminal justice, the analysis of conflict and governance, and then I work for a group called the African Futures Innovation Program, and we undertake long-term country, thematic, and regional studies throughout Africa. We explore how important development trends are unfolding across time by analyzing variables like agriculture, education, economics, environment, energy, governance, health, infrastructure, and international politics. We provide decision makers with forward-thinking policy analysis to plan key development pathways. This presentation will focus on Africa's long-term development prospects to 2043. Most of the work we do are done using an integrated assessment model called the International Futures Forecasting System, or IFS in short. It was developed and it's housed at the Frederick S. Pardee Center at the University of Denver. The model produces dynamic forecasting for more than 500 variables for 186 countries until the end of the century. It is open source and can be freely downloaded from the Pardee website. Africa has significantly improved many of its key development outcomes in the past couple of decades. It has reduced maternal and infant mortality rates, it's improved food security across the continent, and it's provided access to critical services. So things in Africa are improving. However, Africa is falling short of reaching its full potential. Africa's population will double in the next 3 decades, alongside a climate that is shifting faster than communities can adapt, and deaths and livelihood losses are rising across all countries. Many of the key and critical goals set out by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals will not be achieved by African countries. Along its current trajectory or its current path forecast, it is likely to progress much slower than the rest of the world, even amongst peers in developing regions. Africa's contribution to the global economy will remain small. Africa's labor force is in a poor health condition and is unskilled, and the continent is only likely to enter into a demographic dividend after mid-century. The continent is characterized by low levels of domestic and foreign investment, and the manufacturing sector is struggling across Africa. Extreme poverty is currently 35% of Africa's total population, a ratio that will decline to only 31% by 2030, missing the Sustainable Development Goal. This is the result of rapid population growth, and by 2040 we are forecasting that 486 million Africans are projected to live in extreme poverty. So against this backdrop, the African Union's Agenda 2063 plan provides an ambitious blueprint for Africa to transform the continent into a powerhouse that aims to realize its full potential through inclusive and sustainable growth. We have taken this grand plan and modeled the sectoral interventions proposed therein and created a scenario we call the Combined Agenda 2063 scenario. It is an optimistic but realistic path for Africa's future. It captures potential impact of 12 positive scenarios that can change Africa's development trajectory and maximize its potential for prosperity. The scenarios consist of successful implementation of evidence-based policies and measures that improve stability, advance demographic dividend, unlock an agricultural revolution, invest in health and WASH, improve education, igniting manufacturing, implementing the African Free Trade Area, pursuing technologies, increasing international financial flows, investing in infrastructure, and enhancing accountable governance. These individual and combined scenarios we developed through a process that followed a collaborative approach where 14 international sessions were held with key experts where we benchmarked the inputs and the findings. The results are in this scenario that Africa has huge potential. It has the largest agricultural potential globally. Africa has a wealth of resources and minerals necessary to transition directly to renewable energy. New technologies will accelerate growth across the continent, and Africa's GDP will grow significantly under this scenario. Only 6% instead of 21% of Africa's total population will remain living in extreme poverty by 2043, a significant feat. It is, however, unlikely that improvements in all sectors, as we've modeled in this scenario, will happen simultaneously in all African countries. Regions and individual countries will progress at different paces. So the question many policy and decision makers have are which levers they should pull where to stimulate optimal development. We therefore publish all the information, the scenarios, through an open access website we call the African Futures website. The forecasts and analysis are provided for each of Africa's 54 countries and various geographical regions, regional economic zones, and income groups. All the quantitative modeling results are made available in this interactive website. The website aims is to provide forecasts and practical policy recommendations to guide policymakers and decision makers in their pursuit to implement sustainable development on the continent. I'm going to now give you the first sneak peek of our website, and I hope you enjoy this.
This website models potential progress towards the African Union's Agenda 2063 vision through the individual and combined impact of various sectoral scenarios. The forecasting horizon coincides with the end of the third 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063 in 2043. You can view the future of Africa geographically or thematically. All information is free and available to download after registration. The Geographic Future section of the website covers each of Africa's 54 countries, 5 regions, the 8 regional economic communities, or RECs, recognized by the African Union, and the 4 country income groups, as defined by the World Bank. In each, you can review the likely current path forecast and the impact of 12 sectoral scenarios such as on demographics, agriculture, education, and leapfrogging. You can access the Geographic Future page for each geography by clicking on the map on the home page or the menu bar. Each geographic report contains a summary, 60 interactive charts, the current path forecast, and the effect of 12 sectoral scenarios, such as the impact of more stability, a demographic dividend, better health wash infrastructure, or the impact of the combined Agenda 2063 scenario. Each chart is interactive and accompanied by interpretive text. You can change the settings for each chart, as well as register and download the data. Charts can also be embedded and shared into your own site and writings. A content drop-down menu is provided for easy navigation. Use the PDF buttons on the page to download sections of a page or the full geographic report in an easily printable format. This feature requires registration, which is instant and free. The Thematic Futures section starts with an overview of Africa's current path, followed by a discussion, analysis, and forecast of different sectoral scenarios, such as agriculture, education, and manufacturing, and the impact of a combined Agenda 2063 scenario. It's easy to click through to any of these sectors using the navigation bar on the left. For example, to explore Africa's demographic future and how Africa can advance its demographic dividend, the page provides a summary, all the associated charts, and comprehensive interpretation. You can then navigate and read as you wish, and also register to download material. The website also provides additional resources in the Special Reports section, such as various in-depth country and regional studies on specific issues. Resources takes you to the Africa Tomorrow blog, the archive, and the events page. Africa Tomorrow consists of opinion pieces written by some of the foremost thinkers on the future of Africa. The archive includes presentations and related material. The events page provides information on upcoming and completed seminars and events. By creating a free account and by subscribing here, you will be kept up to date on new developments and events. The About link provides more information on the work of the African Futures and Innovation team, the modeling platforms used for the forecasts, country and income groups, the team behind the site, and our partners and donors. In summary, this site serves as a comprehensive resource to help government, business, and civil society plan for the future by presenting realistic forecasts across different sectors and geographies. The site is constantly updated and will continue to evolve based on your feedback and input. For more information, feedback, or to get in touch, please reach out to the team.
Okay. Thanks for that presentation. Sorry, I forgot the phone. And I don't think that she is online, actually, to answer questions.
I am online.
Oh, you are? Very good. So if there are questions, that's great, actually. Yes.
I'm Vanessa Schweitzer from the University of Waterloo. And so congratulations on this. This looks like a really impressive site. One of the things that I was hearing, though, in the what the site is built for, I was curious, I guess my question is first wondering about how this kind of modeling, how has it been supporting the relationships that are being described between governments, civil society, and so forth to actually get Africa on the best development path?
Did you get the question, or should I repeat that?
I did get the question. Thank you very much. It's about how the relationships, it has supported the relationships. So the work we normally do are in support of policy makers, showing how their policy measures and the various policies they put forth will impact their countries. So up until now, we've been doing very much just country studies, supporting policymakers on a country level. And because we are a non-profit organization, we are an independent think tank. This is normally not influenced by the policies themselves or influenced by any political agenda. So we normally put forth just where the development trajectory is heading and then which levers to pull. And this is the evidence that we then provide to the various policymakers. It has translated into many policy documents that sometimes get used and sometimes they don't. It is normally opinion pieces that we held workshops for and then engage civil society, the policymakers, and then various people that's active within these domains to come together and to talk about some of these evidence-based. And what we found most of the times is this is just a platform for engagement and is a platform for showcasing the evidence and then actually just starting the conversation more than influencing the conversation. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, yeah, there's nodding. Then I want to actually open up with any last remaining burning questions to all of the speakers. Let's see here, because I also have the feeling people are getting a little bit warm in this room.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I guess, across all the speakers, how you do or would start to endogenize SDGs as targets. I mean, I think the presentation on India talked about that well. And it's easy to conceptualize how one might have like a climate target and then raise a carbon price to reach that. But I think a lot of other SDG indicators are harder to conceptualize how you would endogenize that goal instead of like exogenously going in and setting efficiency predictions or cost curves and whatnot. And so I'm just kind of curious what the thoughts are on how you might do that in the future or how you're going about doing that now.
Yeah, let me give that to Björn, who has done the most recent comprehensive version of this.
Yeah, that's a great question. Something that we also struggled a little bit initially. So the way we did it now for the study is that, as you said, climate is kind of in the hard optimization of the model. Many other things we looked at, and we tried to relate SDG outcomes to some of the scenario assumptions or policies implemented in the model, and then kind of iteratively through us looking at the outcome in a particular SDG dimension, tracing back to what it relates to in the assumption space and in the policy space, and then making modifications there and rerunning the model. So it's not a full or in a mathematical sense, multi-objective optimization, but through our kind of manual intervention in scenario building, it moves sort of ever so slightly in that direction.
Okay, thanks. I see. Yeah, one more, and then.
Yeah, I had a question for Detlef on the target space. I understand why you want to narrow it down to like indicators so you can compare studies, but these models are really used a lot also for policy decision making, policy support. Don't you risk that the policy decisions are then really also biased by that selection that you're making in the future? Because I think some SDGs are way more relevant for some regions than for others. And I think there's a real risk that the process starts being tweaked by what's necessary from or useful from a scientific point of view.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. And we had some warnings about that actually in the paper as well, that it should not lead to bias where only those that we selected would be looked upon. Still, we thought it was useful at some point if there was some harmonization would happen. So we also, actually the paper has a lot of invitations to also respond to the indicators that we selected. We had a conference actually at the IIASA with maybe 100 people present that did the first selection, and then there was a smaller group that did. So in that sense also, there's a bias, and so therefore I think this is a first proposal. It should help to harmonize some of the literature. It should not rule out that people also look at other targets, and secondly, it should actually improve over time.
One last question, and then we're gonna close the session.
It's not a question actually, it's more like a comment. We've been talking with Bjorn and also Detlef about the idea of working on an SDG research agenda, given the fact that SDG is becoming like a emerging field on its own, and it's a community in shaping. So there's this opportunity to maybe better introduce or differentiate what the SDG research is with the neighboring fields like conservation science, climate change, what it can learn from these neighboring fields, that in what ways it can inform them, and and perhaps with some suggestions for future directions. So if anyone is interested or has any idea, feel free to approach myself or Bjorn during the next 2 or 3 days. Thank you.
Thanks, that sounds good. Julia, it's very urgent? Or? Well, then make it now, then we have it over with.
A small group. No, it's more for the sustainability community actually. So because you mentioned that with the policymakers, that's why I remembered. My perception in all the policy advice I give is that the SDGs, we have created that research community researching the SDGs, but I don't see it on top of the agenda of policymakers anymore. I mean, we did very many comparative case studies on institutional arrangements for the SDGs in developing countries. SDGs are just not on the agenda, and these institutions are like not there and not in place. So I think if we want to do policy advice, we should focus on interlinkages of the goals as such without stressing the goals too much, because many people or policymakers don't listen to the SDG narrative anymore, unfortunately. But if we want to make a case, it should be about sustainability and not the SDGs as such, I'm afraid.
True, and yes, you can have the closing words.
Just to mention what I forgot briefly, we have 2 posters, one physical one by Jihun, who is in the room, and I think one virtual poster, so I invite you to check these out. And besides that, thanks a lot for the great presentations, the very interesting discussions, and I hope we can follow up also over the next couple of days.
You can definitely in person, and you can also keep the discussion going on the event page of this session. Tag the speakers if you have a question to them tonight. You think, should have asked that, and they'll get notified. And well, except Detlef, he's not on Connect, but the rest is there. Okay, have a good coffee break.